Okay, so it's 10 o'clock. So I'd like to begin. So welcome to 2023 Theoretical Linguistics at Keio University and Eastern Michigan University, EMU. Linguistics as Scientific Inquiry Lecture Series number 3, working toward the strong interpretation of SMT. I'm Hisatsugu Kitahara at Keio University. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to welcome all of you. We are very happy to be with Noam Chomsky, the founder of generative grammar, and T. Daniel Seedy, the leading scholar in this generative enterprise. There are many people that we would like to thank for their support, and we will mention their names as we proceed today's lecture. But before we start, please allow us to acknowledge one person, our friend and colleague, the late Samuel David Epstein. He was the original planner of this lecture series, and we would like to thank Sam for all his work and friendship over many, many years. Okay, so let me explain the format. For next 10 days, we will have 5 sessions. Each session consists of about 1 hour lecture and 15-minute Q&A period. This is going to be a closed intensive seminar, but all 5 lectures will be recorded and uploaded and will be publicly available to everyone. Today, I will chair this session with Asako Uchibori from the University of Tokyo. Okay, so let me give you a quick introduction of today's speaker. T. Daniel Seedy, professor of linguistics and the coordinator of the linguistics program at Eastern Michigan University, EMU. Daniel received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and his research is focused on biolinguistic theory, specifically on language as an organ of the human brain. His work in syntax has appeared in such journals as Linguistic Inquiry and Syntax. He is the co-author of numerous articles and a number of books, including Derivations in Minimalism, 2006, Explorations in Maximizing Syntactic Minimization, 2015, and the Minimized Theory of Simplest Merge, 2022. He's also the recipient of many teaching awards and honors. Without further ado, please welcome Professor T. Daniel Seedy. The title of the lecture is Merge and the Strong Mimesis. Daniel, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share the screen and okay, let me just do a final check. You can see the PowerPoint okay, everybody?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right, so we'd like to start with many thanks to co-authors and collaborators. This talk is based in part on long discussions with and a joint paper by Noam Chomsky, Robert Berwick, Sandoe Fong, Kisa, Rini Huybregts, Andrew McInnerney, myself, and Yushi Sugimoto, a paper that Hisa mentioned that will appear in the Elements in Generative Syntax volume, Cambridge, edited by Bob Freidin. We'll also draw from work with Chris Collins, earlier paper by Kitahara and Seely, years worth, in fact, decades worth of work with Epstein, Kitahara, and Seely, EKS, and Miki Obata. So we'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking all of them. This talk explores the history and the current form and function of the structure building operation merge, the most fundamental operation of the narrow syntax, perhaps even the only operation of the narrow syntax. We'll provide a brief and highly selective history of structure building devices from phrase structure rules to the introduction of merge in Chomsky's bare phrase structure. We'll then talk about what EKS refer to as the maximize minimal merge program, maximizing the effects of merge and minimizing its form, striving ultimately for the thesis that a recursive device interacting with the interfaces and subject to third factor just is language in the narrow sense, this a version of Chomsky's strong minimalist thesis. We'll see successive stages in the development of merge, reaching the most recent characterization, really a reconceptualization of merge, the current state of the art, so to speak. This is based on a series of lectures and papers by Chomsky, and including the joint paper that I mentioned. And we hope that all of this will set the stage for Chomsky's most recent work on Miracle Creed in the lectures to come. So you can think of this opening talk as an extended introduction to Chomsky and to some of that work. Let's begin with the orientation and goals of the generative enterprise. And to do that, let's talk about plagiarism. We share words, not so with sentences. There's no sentence thesaurus, and taking someone else's sentences is often unethical. That's plagiarism. The infinity of sentences is the basis for this ethical principle. There are enough sentences to go around for us all to use only our own. And it's the starting point, at least in one sense, of generative grammar and of our discussion of merge. One driving goal of the modern study of language is to determine and explain this property of discrete infinity, the infinite use of finite means. A central component of any theory of language involves generating an infinity of sentences with finite resources. So there is structure building, hence there's a structure building device. The basic picture, oversimplifying and informally, is there's a lexicon consisting of morphemes, themselves consisting of irreducible linguistic features. And inscriptions of these morphemes are drawn out and entered into the workspace. There are computational devices, necessarily computational devices, structure building devices, that use these inscriptions as the raw material for building larger objects. So I can take those inscriptions and build a new object out of them. Those objects that are built are primarily given over to the conceptual intentional interface, giving us a language of thought. And secondarily, those objects that are built are given over for possible externalization to the SM interface, externalization as sound or sign. Our focus is on the computational devices. The objects built must meet conditions imposed by the interfaces, so they have to be legible. And the computation is subject to third factor, these non-linguistic principles. Oversimplifying, we can think of them as the laws of nature. And third factor is sort of surrounding all this and shaping it in various ways. The beauty of the system is that there's minimal linguistic specific apparatus striving toward explanation by appeal to language external principles and mechanisms. Since its inception, the generative enterprise has adopted the biolinguistic perspective on language, understanding language as a property of human biology. It's a cognitive faculty of the human mind. Generative grammar is concerned with the knowledge state, though, so the possession of that knowledge, not its use, asking, among many other questions, what does the knowledge of language consist of? What's the best theory of this knowledge? Where did it come from in the species? How does it emerge in the individual? And perhaps the most fundamental question of all might be put this way: how can there be one human language and multiple languages at the same time? So there's an initial state that's uniform for the species. There's one language capacity, so one language in that abstract sense, because there's one human brain. But upon interaction with the environment, we get states attained, and we arrive at what we can call individual languages like Japanese or Bibio. And the question is, how is this possible? It's clear from these central goals and questions that the generative enterprise is concerned with explanation, not just description. Though the resulting empirical findings are crucial to the enterprise, it's not enough to describe the properties of some language using whatever unconstrained mechanisms might be around to get the job done, covering the data. generative grammar has from the outset been concerned with the explanation of the properties of language. So why these properties take the shape that they do? Why are they this way and not some other way? Why might they exist in the first place? How do you know when you've explained something? Well, that's a very hard question, but one aspect of explanation involves simplicity. Historically, what we find throughout the development of the generative enterprise is a reduction of the inventory of the theoretical postulates within the syntax. So what was construction specific, the rules of relative clause formation and language particular, like the rules of French, or syntax specific in earlier stages of the framework, was reduced or factored down or eliminated, distilling out these general principles, standard practice in the sciences. The effects of these postulates in large part are derived from the interaction of the syntax with the interfaces, and were derived from general principles of computational systems, notions of computational efficiency, like least effort, ideally laws of nature. As Chomsky has often stated, it's long been clear that the quest for simplicity is closely related to the quest for explanation. So a good starting point for explanation is the recognition that three factors enter into the growth of language in the individual, as laid out in Chomsky's three factors paper: genetic endowment, the first; experience, the second factor; and laws of nature, the third factor. Now, from the outset, the goals regarding the content of the innate computational system, the first factor, were in conflict. So on the one hand, descriptive adequacy, getting the facts right, seemed to require that the innate endowment be rich in available mechanisms, initially including multiple and rather complex subcomponents for structure building and structure manipulation. So it seemed as though UG had to be big. On the other hand, given the apparent recent evolution of language in the species, the innate computational system must be simple, as laid out in Chomsky and Berwick and Chomsky. A complex, multifaceted system couldn't have evolved in so short a period of time, and parsimony is also just good scientific explanation. So on the other hand, it seemed as though the innate system had to be small. The attempt to deal with these conflicting demands characterizes much of the history of the generative enterprise. How can the system be made as simple as possible while at the same time maintaining descriptive adequacy? That's a challenging task, and it marks a central research goal of the framework. So there's just a little on orientation and goals. Let's turn now to a brief and informal and rather selective history of structure building. So pre-merge recursive phrase structure rules solve the problem of discrete infinity. The computational system could operate on its own output. So with just these two phrase structure rules, I can have an infinite output. The first rule can build an object, and that output can serve as input to the second rule, and that can serve as input to the first, and so on and so on and so on. A finite apparatus with infinite output, and that's an important step. But the system had to face the pervasive empirical problem of displacement. So in something like, who did you visit? Who is understood in one position, but it's pronounced in another. So it looked as though more than just phrase structure rules were needed, a different set of operations. A transformational component seemed to be required. So phrase structure could build an object, and then among the powers of transformation was displacement. So something can go from there to there with the structure staying the same. Now, Chomsky has stressed the oddity of displacement. Why would human linguistic systems have such a thing? With respect to communicative efficiency, this is arguably non-optimal design, pronounced in one position and interpreted in another. And we know this from the parsing literature. But at the time, no real answer to this question could be given. It was just noted as an oddity. Again, the picture was, you've got these two components, phrase structure and transformations. And we stress that at this stage, they're fundamentally distinct. But overall, that was some progress. Solution to discrete infinity, a coherent system with wide empirical coverage, but there's this unrelenting quest for explanation. So the framework was subject to what, in hindsight, we might call minimalist scrutiny. A series of why questions were asked. For example, phrase structure rules were completely unconstrained. Anything could be rewritten as anything. So I could have a phrase structure rule like that, or a phrase structure rule like that. But certain patterns were found. So you could have different material before and after a verb, but it had a verb in it. Likewise for the other lexical categories. The phrase structure rules themselves provided no explanation for this. It was true by stipulation. So why is there a mother node above the verb? And the answer is, well, because that's the way the phrase structure rules were defined. It was axiomatic. It was true by stipulation, true by definition. So there was no real answer to the question, why these rules and not others? Such considerations led to the next stage in the development of structure building devices, namely XBAR. Rather than the unconstrained stipulated phrase structure rules, the XBAR template imposed tight restrictions on what counts as humanly possible phrase structure representation. XBAR sought to eliminate phrase structure rules, leaving only the general template. And XBAR pushed endocentricity to its logical conclusion, since some categories were endocentric. They all are. That's the null hypothesis. Recursion was maintained. That was carried over from the standard phrase structure rules. And one result is that the inventory of old style phrase structure rules was massively reduced. So rather than language specific rules, you come down to just the few rules that gave you the template. So we see simplification. That was important. Another innovation is removing linear order. So classic phrase structure rules would give you both linear order, precedence relations, and dominance relations. XBAR just gave you the dominance relation, moving precedence into the sensory motor interface where it seemed to belong. And we see the beginnings of the role that the interfaces might play. So with XBAR, you have a structure like tree like this, and those things are not linearized. The hierarchical relations are established, and that's what CI needs, and the only thing CI cares about, but the linear order can come later. Likewise for the different projections. And this gave us a way to characterize this notion of one language and multiple languages, UG and states attained. So part of UG would be that XBAR template, and that's sort of this mobile that's spinning that's linearizable in various ways. So here I can get a notion of UG and states attained. Note further that there remained a transformational component, but it too, like the phrase structure component, was simplified. So language and construction specific transformations, different powers of those were distilled out, like movement, NP movement, and WH movement, and ultimately down to move alpha. But note that there were still these two components. So XBAR is structure building, and move alpha informally structure manipulation. And we stress again that those were considered fundamentally distinct. So there's a few steps in the historical development of structure building operations. We see the role of recursion. We see the goal of having a theory of possible human phrase structure. We see simplification of phrase structure, the removal of linear order, and the emergent role of the interfaces. And we see the simplification of various operations. And finally, we see the apparent need of these two separate systems, phrase structure and transformations. Overall, the role of simplification is clear, rather, again, than the language and construction specific categories. So the rules of French or the rules for pseudo-cleft construction, we see the emergence of these general operations and principles without losing empirical coverage. Now, if we're going to simplify phrase structure and transformations, how are we going to maintain this constant balance between descriptive and explanatory adequacy? Well, here, general principles emerged, but many of them, at least, were still linguistics specific, and we'll see that starting to change in important ways. So progress overall can be claimed, but further depth of understanding is always possible. There's where we are, though, late 80s, early 90s, with the introduction of merge in Chomsky's bare phrase structure. Now, there is what seems like a major shift from X-bar to bare phrase structure, from graph theoretic objects like this to set theoretic objects like this. But it's maybe not so radical a change. It did, however, have profound consequences, as we'll see. So consider a typical verb phrase. Where we are in the early 90s is you've got this verb phrase, and you can think of the verb as the object and of kind of spinning around. There are these mobiles. There's no linear order specified. Well, that's captured in sets. So the set verb object is the same as the set object verb. So the question then becomes, what about the label? Well, for bare phrase structure merge, the label was carried over into the resulting object. So with phrase structure, I've got the label there in red, and then I've got the verb phrase. Well, notice that the phrasal information is encoded by the set itself, so that's a phrase. For bare phrase structure, though, that label was moved into the output of merge itself. So the label was actually encoded, it was representationally encoded in the output object of merge. Okay, so on the one hand, bare phrase structure represents a convenient notational device to capture these ideas for generating phrase structure, but we also see here the important role played by the minimalist method. So rather than asking what can be derived or reduced or eliminated from the existing theory, we can approach it from the bottom up, as in UG, approaching UG from below, asking what must we postulate by conceptual necessity, sort of sweep the floor clean. What's the least that we can say about phrase structure? Well, elements larger than lexical items exist. There are phrases, there's discrete infinity. So Chomsky writes, one operation is necessary on conceptual grounds alone, an operation that forms larger units out of those already constructed, call it merge. So bare phrase structure merge works like this. It takes two objects, it builds a new object out of them, and then it projects a label. Okay, we'd like to note next that merge is based on cyclic operations. Earlier approaches were basically rewriting rules from top down or some sort of mixed system. And over the history of this, you can see a fundamental conflict about how generation should take place, top down or bottom up. With a merge-based system, it's bottom up, particularly when merge takes over the work of the transformational component, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. It's bottom up and highly cyclic. And in some sense, this represents a return to some of the earliest work, Chomsky 56, based on phonology, but it was still a cyclic system. And we'll have more to say about that a little bit later. So let's pause for an interim summary. We're looking at the form and function of merge within the context of the strong minimalist thesis, asking what is the current state of merge and how did we get there? We now have a rather selective and informal history of merge, from phrase structure rules to the introduction of bare phrase structure merge. Let's turn now to this maximized minimal merge. This is an expression used by EKS starting about 9 years or so ago to refer to the twin interconnected goals of maximizing the explanatory effects of merge while minimizing its form. Maximizing the explanatory effects postulate as few operations as possible beyond merge. As Chomsky notes, a far-reaching view is that merge is the only narrow syntax operation. With respect to minimizing form, well, reduce merge to its simplest unified form, just put two things into a set, build a new object out of them, and don't project a label. There are various examples of the first goal, maximizing the explanatory effects of merge. So the derivational approach to syntactic relations of the late Sam Epstein and colleagues. The only relations available to the narrow syntax are those established by merge deriving C command. C command, what you're merged with, and the terms of what you're merged with, the terms, just the members of the members. This is still assumed, at least in one sense, in Miracle Creed. Optimally, language keeps to the simplest relations. Sister, co-member of, term of, so the members of members, and C command, basically terms of your sister. And that will return, as we'll see a little bit later. Another example is the control component being reduced to merge, work by O'Neill and Hornstein, where the control component is eliminated in favor of just using what you've already got, namely merge. We'll see a rather different view of this in the recent work. There's the possible role that merge can play in the morphology, a nice recent paper by Collins and Kane and work by others. And crucially, for present purposes, is the reduction of the transformational component to the structure building component. So work by Kitahara in the mid-90s. Recall where we left off earlier. We said there are these two components, and we kept stressing they were fundamentally distinct. Well, with merge, it was realized that it's the same operation that's giving us both. And maybe that's only in the last few years been fully appreciated. So suppose I have two objects floating there in theoretical space like that and that. What merge says is take two things and build a new thing out of them. So I'm going to take those two things and I'm going to build a new thing out of them. And you project a label. Let's put that aside for now. Well, I can do exactly the same thing over here. I'm going to take two objects, that one, and I'm going to put them into a set. I'm going to build something out of them. One is contained inside the other, but we didn't say anything about the source. So take two objects, there they are, and I'm going to put them into a set. Those objects are going to stay intact. And there I get displacement with reconstruction. So remember the question that was left over earlier, why should there be displacement? With merge, looked at in this way, the question is turned around. It's not why is there displacement, but why would you not have displacement? You'd need a stipulation not to have it. There's displacement because there's merge. So why is there displacement reduces to the question, why is there merge? Merge can apply in these two ways. There's one operation, but it can apply in two ways. Externally, take two objects that are separate, or internally, take two objects, one of which is contained inside the other, and build a new thing out of them, merge those together. Again, just a single operation, two modes of application. External merge is basically the phrase structure component, and internal merge takes over crucial powers of the transformational component, namely displacement. So we can reduce those down to just the same single operation. Now, this was an important development in the history of the theory, and now we can overall see massive simplification. So the phrase structure rule is down to X bar, transformations, distilling out these powers like just displacement, one of the properties of transformations, ultimately down to move alpha. And now you can take this final step down to merge. And if you put all of that together, you see massive simplification of the system overall. And then the question becomes, what takes over the work of all of those different rules? And we'll see the emerging role of the interfaces and third factor. So we've looked a little bit at goal number one, maximizing the explanatory effects of merge, many other examples of that. Let's turn to the second goal, minimizing its form. The basic idea here is the following. Bare phrase structure merge goes like this. Take two things, put them into a set, and project a label. So bare phrase structure merge is complex. It's got two parts, the relation creating component, and then it's got a label projection, a label creating component. Well, Collins was the first to subject bare phrase structure merge to minimalist scrutiny, asking, can it be simplified? Well, you can't eliminate the relation creating part if you're going to have any syntax at all, but you can attempt to eliminate the label projection part. So what Collins attempts to do, and what Seeley, following Collins and using some different arguments, attempts to do, is to derive the effects of labels from independently motivated mechanisms. And ultimately, what you reach is simplest merge. That is, merge X, Y, you put them into a set, and that's it. You build a new thing out of them. There are no projection of labels. So here we've reached simplest merge. A next stage in the development of merge, again, this is a rather selective history, is Chomsky's problems of projection and extensions. We'll refer to these as POP. Now, POP represents an important example of eliminative minimalism. Among other things, POP attempts to eliminate as separate conditions, the extended projection principle and the empty category principle. So on the surface, it looks as though POP is a return to labels. So a POP, after all, has a labeling algorithm, and there are various papers with reference to that labeling algorithm. And POP says that the EPP and the ECP are reduced to labeling theory. EKS in an LI paper attempt to derive continuation of movement. I move to a position and need to move on, and halting in criterial position from labeling. Also arguing that maybe agree is just labeling. But in a recent paper, Collins and Seeley say that that's something of a misnomer. So in fact, there are no labels in POP if by label you mean that you've got something that's encoded in the representation itself, something that's part of the power of merge, that merge actually creates the thing. POP derives the effects of labels from minimal search, and that's entirely consistent with Collins. So a POP offers a new and particularly insightful answer to the fundamental question: if there are no labels and no projection, how is the information provided by labels to be derived, to be provided? And POP's answer on the conceptual level is beautifully simple with respect to categorical identification of a syntactic object at the interface. So I've got to know if it's a noun thing or a verb thing at the interfaces. The label information is provided by independently available lexical features of lexical items, and third factor, minimal search. And that's consistent again with Collins. So for POP, labeling is just the process of finding the object identifying information. Labeling is just minimal search, presumably appropriating a third factor principle, POP states. So the relevant information about a syntactic object will be provided by a single designated element within it. So ultimately, the relevant features of a linguistic item of a lexical item, head. So minimal search, the search part is just what's available for computation. It's the minimal part that gives you efficient computation. So suppose I have a verb phrase that has to be identified, we're assuming, at the interfaces as a noun thing or a verb thing. Well, there are various heads inside there that could, in principle, serve as a identifier. So the search part says there are a bunch of heads. The minimal part says do it efficiently. I've got a choice point here So the efficient computation says, take the one that you get with least effort. That's the minimal search. So the basic idea is I've got this verb phrase, I look inside it, and I'm going to find two things. So the first step is going to be look at it, and I'm going to find the members of that set, and the members are going to be the head and the object. Well, the head is the only thing that's going to have relevant features. So at the point where this is given over to the interpretive components, search is going to give you that output, and the interfaces can say, I see a verb, I'll use that as the relevant head. Now, if you don't have the relevant features for identification of the whole phrase. Now, if you didn't have the efficient part, you could keep going and you could find other heads. So again, the question is, which of those do I choose? And least search or minimal search says, do the one with least effort. Alan Ke has a PhD dissertation from the University of Michigan, a recent one that deals with search in some detail and a number of papers. I encourage you to take a look at that work. Now, we know things get more complicated with the XPYP situation where search is ambiguous, locating those two heads. Now, if they share features, the resulting features will be the identifier. We'll put that aside for right now. The critical point we want to make in the present context is for POP, merge stays in its simplest form. It is simplest. Labels and projection are derived from third factor, and that's consistent with Collins. So let's pause for another interim summary. Our central goal is to explore the form and function of merge. What's its current state? How did we get there? We've looked a little bit at some history. We've now looked at this maximize minimal merge program, which again is one version of Chomsky's strong minimalist thesis. Ideally, we'd have a recursive device interacting with the interfaces and constrained by third factor, these non-linguistic principles, and that just is language. Let's take a look now at some of the recent developments, the current state of the art, so to speak. Where things stand as of the last few years, there's simplest merge, and it works like this: take two things and build a new thing out of them, and there are no labels. There's one operation with two modes of application, recall. External, take two objects that are separate. Internal, take two objects, one of which is contained in the other, and build a new object out of them. Well, this leaves open many possibilities, many questions. So we can ask, for example, can any two objects be merged? And is any output licensed? So, for example, suppose I have these two objects. Can I take that one, and can I take X and Z, where Z is a term, a member of a member, where Z is a term of the other object? Well, those two objects are separate. Is that possible? Can I merge those two things together, giving me something like that? Is that some instance of external merge, overlapping sets? Well, yeah, that's parallel merge, Barbara Chitko's work. Relative to the on phases approaching UG from below, the feature inheritance framework of Chomsky, we can have a situation like this. I build all the way up to the CP, and now I want to internally merge the external argument with the TP. So here's one object contained inside the other. Both of them are contained inside an even larger object, a bigger object. Is that an instance of internal merge? Well, relative to that framework, that was allowed. Relative to the on phases framework, that was possible. That was countercyclic subject raising. So to the question, can any two syntactic objects be merged? The answer would seem to be yes. There's parallel merge, there's countercyclic raising, there's sidewards merge, there's late merge, and others that you could think up. As for output, there's at least one case where an output was considered problematic. So again, internal to the on phases framework, EKS talk about these double peak structures. We'll use the tree here because it's a little easier to see. So strictly applying simplest merge, I'm going to take the external argument and I'm going to merge it with the TP. I'm going to merge those two things together. But strictly applying merge, the output has got to be something like this. You can't disconnect the C and then insert the newly created TP in there. That would be replacement. Bob Freidin, in his 1999 paper, gives compelling arguments against replacement. So what EKS say is, look, this is the result you're going to get. You're going to have intersecting sets. The system can build it. The syntax can build that, but it's not tolerated in the narrow syntax. So the derivation halts unless something happens. So this twin-peaked entity is not tolerated. Transfer then takes one out of there, and then the derivation can continue. So this was a way that EKS attempted to deduce the timing of cyclic transfer. The critical point we want to make in the present context is here was at least one case where an output of merge was considered, at least temporarily, problematic. So it's at this stage that this recent work by Chomsky enters, again, a series of lectures and papers and the joint paper that summarizes this and gives some further details of it. As Chomsky can do, like no other, he takes a fresh look at merge, reconceptualizing merge. One step is to formally recognize the workspace, which through much of the merge era was left unspecified. So consider what we had earlier. We said, suppose you had these two objects sort of floating through theoretical space. I'm going to take that one, and I'm going to put them together. Well, let's take a closer look at what's happening here. I've got two objects and I'm building them in parallel. So we can ask informally and sort of metaphorically speaking, where are the objects that merge is targeting? Well, that's unspecified. Take two things and put them into a set. Well, does it matter? Does their source matter? Does where they are matter? And we can ask, where are the non-targets of merge? What happens to them? So consider a situation like this. Suppose I have two things, XP and YP, and I put them into a set. Well, suppose that there's other material around, lexical items or other objects that we've built in parallel. What happens to that other material, the non-merge ease, so to speak, when I put XP and YP together? Merge itself just says, put two things into a set, doesn't say anything at all about any other material that happens to be around. That's also unspecified. So does the where matter? Does the where have properties? And if so, do these properties play a role in syntax, in the syntax? Well, on one view, at least, those are some of the questions taken up in this recent work. And it was the failure to explicitly address such questions that led to these extensions, so-called extensions. Chomsky calls them extensions of merge. In some sense, merge was too simple, leaving open the idea that any two syntactic objects could be merged and any output was possible. So one result of this recent work is to specify what was unspecified, and one step is to formally recognize the workspace. Conceptually, the workspace is not the lexicon and it's not the interfaces. It is rather where syntactic computation happens. The minimal characterization of the workspace is that it's a set of inscriptions, a set of syntactic objects that have entered the derivation so far. It's just a set. We're going to use these cubes because maybe it'll be a little easier to follow with a PowerPoint like this. But those are sets. And it also gives us a set of available computational resources at any given point in the derivation. So I can add lexical items and build material out of them. I can add and build and add and build. And what I've got is this set of the computational resources at any point, any given point in the derivation. Merge is then reformulated to apply to the workspace. It takes a workspace as input, and it's going to give a modified workspace as output. So we have a relationship, something like that. And now a question we can ask is, what does merge do to the workspace? Well, what's the least that we can say about merge applying in a vacuum? So let's remove it from humans and put aside third factor considerations. What's the least that we can say? Well, merge is a structure building operation. It builds a piece of structure using the resources available to it, thereby adding that structure to the workspace. So the least we can say is something like build structure, put things together, put things in the workspace, put things that are in the workspace together. And ideally, that's it. That's what merge is formally specified to do. It targets elements in the workspace. It puts those elements into a set, expressing that the elements are in a relation, so they're traditionally a phrase. The newly created set is now a member of the workspace, defining a new state of the workspace, which is then available for further computation. So again, this is just build structure, and it's completely unconstrained. That's the simplest thing we can say. Relative to applying to the workspace, that's simple merge. But a host of questions immediately arise. So again, how are the objects selected? How many objects are selected and why? Do the targets of merge remain in the workspace? Do the non-targets of merge remain? Why or why not? But that's merge in a vacuum. And now let's sort of take merge and drop it into a human and see what constraints it might be subject to with respect to third factor. So maybe think of it this way. You take this general notion of build structure and you sort of drop it into the real world, so to speak. General properties of computational systems will affect it. Properties of the human organic systems will affect it. So again, let's take this build structure, sort of drop it into the real world, and what you're going to get out the other side is third factor compliant constrained merge. Merge is constrained in various ways, but the goal is not to build those constraints into the definition of merge, but for them to follow from these more general non-linguistic principles toward what Chomsky refers to as genuine explanation, appealing to minimal first factor and third factor. Chomsky notes next that computation is Markovian. It doesn't have look back. So I add things to the workspace, I build something out of them, and then that previous state is unavailable. So at each stage, I've got only the latest point. I've only got the output. Okay, so now let's ask, how many objects does merge apply to? Well, it's binary. The simplest choice for language is going to be 2. If I'm going to build anything, I've got 2. So by parsimony, that's sufficient. As Miracle Creed states, binary relations permit the fewest options for carrying the derivation forward, a sufficient reason for keeping n to 2. So merge is binary. Wide-ranging empirical evidence for that as well. So binary merge, now we can ask, are any 2 objects in the workspace available to merge? Well, Chomsky states that for an object to apply, for an operation to apply to objects, those objects have to be located. So we can abstract out the locating process, formulating and exploring its properties. This is referred to as search. A search is going to locate things in the stepwise fashion. For merge, I need 2 things. So find one and then another, find P and then Q. And we expect merge, we expect search. We expect search to conform to third factor requirements of minimal computation. Okay, so we have minimal search. So first locate P and then Q. How is it going to work? Well, the first step of minimal search is find the first thing with least effort. So I'm going to look into the workspace. So take any member of the workspace. Those are the first things that I find. So P, step one, take any member of the workspace. Step two, I'm going to find Q. Well, there are two ways I can do that. Take a member of the workspace, another member of the workspace, or you've already got a hold of P, just look into P. In fact, that's the simplest one. So that's the least search. I find P, I look into it for a term and take the first thing inside it that I'm looking for. That's the one that we expect to get. And the question becomes, why would there ever be external merge? And we'll return to that in a minute. It has to do with theta theory, if you're going to have propositional structure. Okay, so immediately this gives us only EM and IM as they're sort of classically defined. The extensions of merge are disallowed. So suppose I have a workspace. Merge step one, take any member of the workspace. Suppose I take that one. Step two, take any other member of the workspace. That's possible. If I'm going to build a theta structure, for example, using external merge, I can do that. But what I can't do is take P, that's one step, but now look inside another object, another member. That would be more effort. So that doesn't conform to minimal search. So you can't do that. So parallel merge and the like are disallowed under this view. But with internal merge, I can do this. I can take P, that's step one. P is then the search domain for Q. I can look inside it and find Q, the first thing that I happen to be looking for, and I can put those two things together. So EM and IM. So merge is binary. It's subject to minimal search, not by stipulation, but by third factor. It follows that you can't take any two syntactic objects and merge them together. It's restricted. That's not built into the definition of merge, though. Only those that you can locate with least effort. Note that this disallows extensions of merge, and note also in passing that EKS argued with earlier versions of this that you actually derive the extension condition and the proper binding condition, and I think that's still true, but we'll put that aside for now. Note next that computation is subject to preservation, what Chomsky calls preservation. Preservation is a general constraint normal for all computation in formal systems. So the inscription 3 doesn't change its interpretation, or the line of a proof Q doesn't change. The interpretation of an inscription does not change in the course of computation. That's just assumed for computational systems. In fact, that's a defining property of computational systems, Chomsky notes. Okay, so it follows from preservation that the non-targets of merge are preserved in the workspace. So if I target P and Q and I build a new thing out of them, this predicate right here, this non-target of merge, this predicate, this non-target of merge can't just go away in that mapping. To delete it would be to change the interpretation of the inscription. So deletion isn't allowed. That's disallowed by preservation, at least on one view. Merge then takes two elements, puts them into a set. That's the structure building part. It's binary. There's no linear order encoded in it. There are no labels. Those are derived as in POP. It adds that structure. So that structure is now part of the workspace. And all elements that are not P and Q, so the non-mergees, so to speak, are preserved intact in the workspace. Okay, what about P and Q themselves? P and Q, the targets of merge. Should P and Q be preserved? Well, by preservation, they can't just delete. And P and Q are not internally altered. You can't change them because that would change their interpretation. So if I have an object like this, here's an object in the workspace, I'm going to find P, and now I'm going to go inside it. Suppose I'm looking for a WH, I'm going to take the first one, and that's Q. I put those together. There I've got displacement with reconstruction. So again, here's P and here's Q. Here's P and here's Q. I put P and Q together. P and Q have to stay intact. So there's P and there's Q. what immediately follows is I've got structurally identical inscriptions. Structurally identical inscriptions arise with an application of internal merge. In fact, structurally identical inscriptions arise with any application of merge. It's just internal merge where you see them, as we'll see as we proceed. Okay, so there they are, two structurally identical inscriptions. They necessarily arise. But so this really derives the no tampering condition too. It should be noted. So should P and Q be preserved? Well, the targets of P and Q are not themselves internally altered. But what about P and Q remaining as members of the workspace? Okay, what's at stake? Well, in the interest of, okay, so yeah, what's at stake? Well, with formal systems, material remains available. That's what it means to be recursive. So in a line of a proof, if I have Q and P and I put them together to get P and Q, the lines remain. They don't just go away. The whole thing remains. So based on that, I would say, okay, I'm going to take P and Q, put them into a set, and then P and Q are going to remain as members of the workspace. So there's an empirical problem with this, and in the interest of time, we won't go through all the details, but as Chomsky notes in the UCLA lecture, if I do allow P and Q to remain in the workspace, I'll overgenerate islands. Again, we're not going to go through the details, but the basic idea is that if who, say, a WH can remain in the workspace, I could build up indefinitely and then externally merge it in, and that would yield a island violation. But it's at this point that Chomsky appeals to some work by Sandaway Fong, who writes, the brain is not the computational powerhouse that we might assume. There's evidence that the brain does not maximize sensory capacity, which suggests the computational brain is the weak link in the chain from external stimulus to thought. Appealing to this, Chomsky in his UCLA lectures writes, it's not unexpected that the generative operations for an organic system should observe more stringent conditions on resource access than normal recursion with no organic limitations. So there is a general principle, restrict resources holding of and encoded in the human brain. Chomsky writes following building on this work of Sandaway Fong. An instantiation of restricted resources holding of language is minimal yield. And that guarantees that merge yields the fewest possible new terms that are accessible to further operations, thereby limiting subsequent search. So merge necessarily constructs one new accessible term. The new thing that I built is a new thing in the workspace. But minimal yield basically says you should produce no more than that one. So there's this external pressure on the workspace saying with every application of merge, you've got to keep it down to just one new thing. Since merge is the sole combinatorial operation of human language, it must meet conditions imposed by organic systems, and hence it's restricted in its output by minimal yield. So suppose that I have P and Q. I'm going to put them together, and that's going to be a member of the workspace. That's a new term that's added. Well, if every member of the workspace were preserved in the output, if every member is carried over, I'm going to have a minimal yield violation because I'm going to have multiple identical inscriptions that will count as new objects given the Markovian character of the system. So I have to disappear something. Once I add a new structure, if I carry everything over, including P and Q, I'm going to have a minimal yield violation. So I've got to disappear something. Well, I can't disappear the non-targets of merge. So this predicate right here, that can't be eliminated because that would violate preservation. So the only option is to disappear, not carry over P and Q themselves. So the output is going to be this. That is the only thing that conforms to minimal yield. P and Q are not themselves altered, and P and Q are not deleted. They're just now terms of the workspace rather than being members of the workspace. They were members of the workspace before, and they were terms of the workspace before, and they're still terms of the workspace. So putting all of this together, an application of external merge is going to look like this. I'm going to take those two objects and merge them together. And this is what we see happening. It looks like replacement. So I'm going to replace the objects that I merged together with the object that was built. But replacement is derived. It's not stipulated. Now, it should be noted in some discussions, Chomsky has noted another way to look at all this. One is if you leave P and Q as members of the workspace, you're never going to get convergence. You're going to have this stuff, this sort of detritus kind of hanging around. If I leave P and Q in the workspace and P and Q always have to be carried over, I'm never going to get a convergent derivation because I'm never going to get a single object. And also, if I don't leave the non-targets, if the non-targets of merge somehow go away, I'm only going to get the successor function. That's another way of looking at this. So far, so good. Next, let's talk about identical inscriptions, repetitions, and the copy relationships. These identical inscriptions are emerging. Other computational systems have structurally identical inscriptions. So I can have something like that or something like that. Structurally identical inscriptions. Well, language can have structurally identical inscriptions as well. Many people criticized many people. Structurally identical inscriptions, as we've noted, also arise with applications of merge. So let's take this and put them together, given the third factor considerations that we just laid out. I'm going to get displacement with reconstruction. So the standard implicit assumption with formal systems is uniform interpretation of identical inscriptions. All identical inscriptions, structurally identical inscriptions, are interpreted in the same way. It just goes without saying, Chomsky notes. Structurally identical inscriptions are just always interpreted in that same way. But language seems to be different. Structurally identical inscriptions can have distinct interpretations. So in many people praised many people, I can have different groups of people. So with language, the question arises, when are these structurally identical inscriptions interpreted in the same way and are therefore copies, structurally identical inscriptions interpreted in the same way? And when are structurally identical inscriptions not interpreted in the same way and are therefore repetitions? The default for formal systems is this uniform interpretation. Just across the board, interpret every identical inscription as the same. For language, the default seems to be structurally identical inscriptions are repetitions. In fact, you only get copies in a limited situation, unless you put them into a copy relation. So with formal systems, Chomsky notes there's an implicit operation form copy. Form copy applies to all structurally identical inscriptions in say, a formal proof, assigning them the same interpretation. But with language, form copy, like merge, must locate the objects in the workspace it applies to. Using computationally optimal search, form the copy relation in the simplest way. And as we noted earlier, optimally, Miracle Creed states, language keeps to the simplest relations. Sister, so a co-member, term of, a member of a member, and term of sister, that's C command. Well, the only one of those that's going to be relevant for forming a relation like form copy is going to be C command. So the result of all this is where X and Y are structurally identical, and XC commands Y, then form copy will interpret X as Y. That is, form copy will apply only when it finds structurally identical inscriptions in the C command configuration. In fact, other operations are like that as well. So form copy is providing information for CI interpretation. So interpret these things as copies. That's the instruction that it gives. So it's natural that it would apply at the phase level, the point of access for these interpretations. So to illustrate, suppose we built up to a typical passive. Here's a passive structure. So I'm going to take P and I'm going to take Q, and now I'm going to put those two things together. I'm going to have structurally identical inscriptions. The structurally identical inscriptions necessarily arise. And we're at the phase level. And then at the phase level, I've got structurally identical inscriptions under C command. So they're going to be assigned to the copy relationship. So let's take stock of the current state of merge. Merge applies to the workspace. And in a vacuum, it is basically just build structure. That's the least that we can say. That's the heart of UG, first factor. But build structure is subject to third factor when it's taken out of the vacuum and again, sort of kind of dropped in the real world, its operation is constrained. So build structure we've seen is going to be subject to general properties of computational systems like preservation, computational efficiency like minimal search, properties of the human organic system like minimal yield. And so what you're going to get as an output is third factor compliant binary merge, not by stipulation, but by these non-linguistic specific principles. Finally, and we'll finish up, merge primarily is serving CI, as we mentioned before. Merge is thus constrained by the requirements of the conceptual intentional system. So the computational system language in the narrow sense has to satisfy conditions specific to organic systems of humans. And one important condition has to do with theta theory. So language must provide predicate argument structure at CI. Chomsky asserts it provides the structures with respect to which certain kinds of semantic information can be determined. Okay, so theta theory is not a general efficiency condition constraining formal systems. It's unique as far as we know to language. So how does merge interact with theta theory? Well, combined with preservation, it gives us duality of semantics, which the Miracle Creed will talk about in some detail, I think. With respect to merging NP arguments, EM creates theta positions and IM is for non-theta positions. So propositional structure and clausal structure. So for instance, suppose I merge a argument into a theta position. Well, I cannot IM that NP into another theta position. That would violate theta theory. It would also violate preservation. So if I IM that noun phrase into a second theta position, that inscription will be getting a different interpretation. In the course of the derivation, its interpretation will change, and that will violate preservation. It'll also violate theta theory. Preservation actually does the job. So as what's one consequence of all of this, obligatory control simply falls out. Okay, this very sparse system appealing to merge and third factor principles of the sort that we've been exploring here. And what you get is this complex property. This is what Chomsky referred to as the enabling function of the system. So suppose I have a structure like that, and I've merged the man into a theta position. Well, now let's suppose that we go up to the matrix predicate. Well, as we just saw, I can't IM that noun phrase up into the subject position. That would violate preservation. So the O'Neill-Hornstein style movement analysis of obligatory control is not possible here. But in Chomsky's system, there's another option. You can build a second instance of the noun phrase the man, build it separately, and then EM it in. So I'm going to build a second instance of the man over here. And now I'm going to externally merge that in. And now I enter the phase level, say, and then form copy can apply. Form copy will see identical inscriptions in the C command relationship. it'll see these identical inscriptions in the C command relationship, and it will assign them to the copy relation. That's given over to CI. It's going to interpret it in the control way. And it's going to be given over to SM, and then at SM, you delete all but one. So I don't pronounce the lower copy, and you get control. Now, with this system, the old NP trace pro distinction follows. So with raising and passive and ergative and other instances like that are classically considered NP trace, it's internal merge plus form copy. With control, obligatory control, it's going to be external merge plus form copy. And I'm able to make the distinction between the NP trace and control, as some of these recent works have pointed out in some detail. So overall, the current form and function of merge, we've taken a look at this informal selective history of merge just to lay the ground for the introduction of merge and bare phrase structure. We then looked at the maximize minimal merge program, striving for Chomsky's thesis that a recursive device interacting with the interfaces and constrained by third factor non-linguistic principles just is language. And we've now looked at some of the features of merge over the last few years, the current state of the art, so to speak, which we hope will set the stage for Chomsky's most recent work in Miracle Creed that we'll be hearing about in the lectures to come. Again, we can think of this as sort of a extended introduction to that work. Overall, if you look at the history of this, UG was initially big, and over time, it's reduced and simplified and reduced and simplified, finally reaching the point where it's just merge. But what you see emerging with that is the role of the interfaces, SM and conceptual intentional, and then critically the role of third factor non-linguistic principles that allow this simplest system merge to have at least hope that it will reach descriptive adequacy, and you see that option being realized. So there are many consequences of this. We've looked at just a few. I'm sure Chomsky will be talking about more in the subsequent lectures. There are many challenges. I'm sure you have many challenges and questions. I'll turn those all over to Hisa and Noam. And then the prospects for the future, at least for us, are very, very exciting. In fact, one of the reasons we wanted to do this is to make this work available so we can all work in this framework. And we hope to see more of that as the lectures proceed. So that's it. Thank you very much. And we conclude.
Thank you very much for giving us a great talk with incredible coverage. So we have a 15-minute question and answer period. So use your function key to raise your hand, and one by one, we'll ask you, we'll go over questions. So anybody who has questions? Howard?
Thank you. That was a nice presentation, Daniel, and a very good rational reconstruction of the history of generative grammar. I say rational reconstruction because, as a lot of people here know, but maybe not everybody knows, it wasn't an actual history of generative grammar. So I thought I would just, that being a sort of big fan of the history of the field, I thought I'd add a few historical footnotes for people who don't already know. So one of them is that the idea that infinity originally was done by the phrase structure component. Well, that isn't true in the classic theory of generative grammar. In fact, until Chomsky 65, infinity was done strictly by the transformational component. Generalized transformations did infinity, and the phrase structure component was specifically limited to giving you just a finite number of structures. So more recent work, I think, is an interesting return to the earlier days.
Yeah.
Another historical footnote. You said that with the advent of X-bar theory, which was a big advance for all the reasons you pointed out, except one, I don't think it was an advance in eliminating linear order. It's if you look at remarks on nominalization, I don't see any hint that linear order is eliminated there. In fact, the only hint I find in Chomsky's early writings of eliminating linear order is in aspects of the theory of syntax, where he spends a few pages talking about phrase structure rules maybe giving you sets, but then he winds up rather vehemently rejecting that possibility. And again, I don't see anything like that in remarks on nominalization. I don't see anything like it until early minimalist era. Finally, this is kind of a trivial point, but I don't see any basis for claiming that we had a big change from graph theoretic theories to set theoretic theories. As far as I can tell, every formalization that Chomsky ever gave was set theoretic. Every one that most of his followers, including me, ever gave was set theoretic. It's true that Chomsky would often draw trees, and I would often draw trees, and you would often draw trees, as you did today, but sort of for ease of exposition. The theory wasn't based on graphs unless I missed something.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Daniel, you want to make any response or comments? Great comments from Howard.
Yeah, thanks. Yep, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Howard. Any other comments or questions or anything you want to add from the audience?
Can I add something to that?
Oh, yes, no.
Howard is quite right that X-bar theory didn't eliminate order, but it should have. That was a failure to see what was being said. Took a little time before we saw, look, we got rid of order. We should have seen it right away. But you're right.
I would agree with
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bob, yes, you can go.
Yeah, well, maybe a couple of things. I mean, one thing I've been thinking about recently is the fact that if you look at the elementary operations that we've been assuming, and you even look at the elementary operations from the past, none of them gave you tree structures directly. You had to interpret things. So I think that, more or less, supports what Howard was saying. The other thing that's interesting, I found, is there's a passage in Aspects where Noam is actually questioning whether phrase structure rules are the right operations. I mean, I can sort of look that up and send it to you, but it's quite striking that even in 1965, Noam was questioning whether there were phrase structure rules. And I remember a lecture in September of 1979 where Noam said, this is early in September, a class lecture, he said, there are no phrase structure rules. And what struck me then, I was sitting next to Howard and I turned to him and said, if there are no phrase structure rules, where do we get phrase structure from? And Howard shrugged. I thought, well, he doesn't know either, but he told me later that he was thinking more along the lines of, well, the way they did it in Lasnik and Cupin. But we went basically from 1979 until 1990. I think it was 2 or 3 before we actually got merge in the manuscript for bare phrase structure, which is, I find it's kind of amazing to think about that.
No, you want to respond or you have any comments?
I think that's right. I was wondering how we should be able to get rid of them, but how are we going to do it?
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Sir,
Yeah.
Mr. Emilio Gonzalez raises his hand.
Okay. Emilio?
Hi. Yeah, I just had a question about, you mentioned about like the implicit operation of FC. I think I was just curious, like what differentiated FC from, say, the labeling algorithm, where I would assume the labeling algorithm isn't implicit? Is it because of the fact that FC falls out of the simplest relations that result from merge, like sisterhood, term of, and C command? And where the labeling algorithm requires an operation that locates particularly features in an element and that doesn't particularly fall out of the simplest relations.
This question may be answered in the following, subsequent lectures, but Daniel, maybe you go first and maybe Noam next.
I guess I'm not quite sure. I mean, there are two different things, labeling just, yeah, you find the single designated object that could give you the identifier, but form copy is going to create a relation between two structurally identical items in a syntactic object. So I think those are different. They both appeal to minimal search in some way, but one is creating a relation. Form copy is creating a relation. It's just assigning a relation to two identical inscriptions, put them into the copy relationship, and then that's relevant for the interfaces.
No, you have anything to add?
On Friday.
Okay. So more discussion coming. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
So if I could just follow up on Howard's point. So
Sure.
I'm just sort of curious now about this history. So if it really was, in essence, always set theoretic, then
Yeah.
I guess there is this question of why, given what we know about sets, linear order, the issue of linear order not being part of it. So was linear order just sort of imposed on it from the outside, just stipulated that these two members of the sets are going to be in a linear order, or were or is there some other mechanism for that, or was it just not really thought about?
In LSLT, it was strictly set theoretic, and the relevant sets were sets of strings, where strings were concatenated items, so they had a linear order. Lasnik and Cupin did it a little bit differently, but we still included linear order. And as Noam said, that was probably a mistake. Certainly by the time Cupin and I were writing our paper, we should have seen that you could dispense with linear order.
Actually, it's just plain ordinary confusion. So that John Wheeler comment about you do the wrong thing for a long time, all of a sudden a simple idea occurs to you and you can wonder, how come I didn't see this years ago?
Right.
We should have, back in 1955. Because there was no reason for concatenation. You can understand why it was tossed in. What you see is sentences in linear order.
Right.
Right. But I think you, Noam, said that that LSLT was basically oriented towards phonetic form.
Yeah, because phonetic form was one of the levels in the system.
Right.
So how do you get it? Well, you just throw it in all the way.
Yeah.
It didn't belong, but that took a long time to realize
Yeah.
that. And as Howard said, when X-bar theory came along, it should have been obvious right there that there's no linear order, that this is just structure, but it wasn't. It took 15 years.
Yeah.
Well, there was also parameter theory in between, where the recognition that the linear order could be different for different languages that have the same hierarchical structure. And it seems to me that was a step in the right direction.
I guess I don't think anybody really saw that at that point we should just separate them. There should be a system of language with no linear order, and linear order just has to do with the sensory motor system. Doesn't have anything to do with language, but that took a long time.
Thank you.
Should have seen it even more clearly when sign language started being studied, because that has only partial linear order, uses the options of visual space to do things simultaneously. Made it even more clear that the ordering is just part of the sensory motor system.
You. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. Anybody, any questions, any comments, clarification? Howard?
Yeah, quick follow-up to Emilio's question, I think, and the answer will probably be Friday. But about form chain. Here's how I understand form chain. We've got 2 identical inscriptions. They're both in theta positions, and one C commands the other, and then we can do form chain. So why can't we start with something like the man likes the man and get the man likes?
I'll talk about that. That's an interesting.
Well,
Sounds like it could happen.
Yeah, one view of that is, I mean, the earlier paper had univocality, saying that the same theta assigner can't assign a theta role to a copy chain. Another view is that would violate the PIC. So you're crossing over a phase barrier. And then in the obligatory control case, if the obligatory control verb is not transitive in the relevant sense, it isn't a phase boundary, then you get it there, but you don't get it across a phase boundary the way you would in something like Bill likes, derived from Bill likes Bill.
Interesting. I think it's going to be tricky, though, to say that try isn't transitive in just the relevant sense, but that's an interesting answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, any comments, follow-up questions? Okay, Noam, do you want to say anything? Final words today?
Well, it's just a great introduction. Laid down all the bases.
Great work, Daniel. Okay, so this closed the first session, and the second session, of course, coming. Please check your time zone, and we'll be here again, and very looking forward to it. Daniel, do you want to close?
Yeah, I'd just like to close by saying thank you, Noam, for being here. We really appreciate it. We're very excited to hear the upcoming lectures. I'm sure it's going to be very stimulating. So just a hearty thank you for taking time out of a busy schedule to be with us over the next 4 meetings. And with that, I hereby close the first lecture. It was great to see you all, and we'll see you again on Friday.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night and good morning. See you.